A Soviet pilot in the 16th Guards Fighter Regiment dives through flak clouds toward a formation of German Ju-87s. At 400 meters, he presses the trigger. 3 shells leave the nose cannon, each 37 millimeters in diameter, containing 0.13 kilograms of TNT. The 4th shell jams. The gun seizes. Official records from the NIIVVS, the Air Force Scientific Research Institute, list mean stoppage after 15 rounds, failure rate exceeding 60%. This was the Bell P-39 Airacobra, an aircraft designed around a single promise: destroy bombers with one shot. Yet in every theater of war, from New Guinea to the Eastern Front, the weapon that defined it failed more often than it worked. By 1944, most pilots simply switched the cannon off. How did America's most ambitious fighter become the only one its own pilots didn't trust? On an engineer's desk at Bell Aircraft lay a 37mm Oldsmobile T9 cannon, 1.68 meters long, weighing 210 pounds. The United States Army Air Corps ordered a fighter to carry it. The requirement was unambiguous. Army Ordnance had tested the T9 against bomber structures at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. A single high-explosive shell penetrated aluminum skin, detonated inside the fuselage, and shredded hydraulic lines, control cables, and fuel tanks. Test officers concluded that one hit would down a twin-engine bomber. The Air Corps wanted that capability installed in a pursuit aircraft. Bell's chief designer, Robert Woods, faced an engineering paradox. The cannon was too long to fit in a wing. Mounting it in the fuselage required placing the engine behind the cockpit to free the nose. That decision, driven entirely by the weapon, defined every subsequent design choice. The engine sat behind the pilot. A 10-foot driveshaft ran beneath the cockpit floor to a gearbox in the nose, then forward to the propeller hub. The 37mm cannon fired through the propeller spinner. 2 50-caliber Browning machine guns flanked it in the upper nose. 4 30-caliber guns were distributed in the wings. The layout was unprecedented. Conventional fighters, the P-40, the Spitfire, the Messerschmitt Bf-109, placed the engine in the nose for balance and simplicity. Bell's design accepted complexity and weight in exchange for concentrated firepower. The prototype, designated XP-39, first flew in April 1939 at Wright Field, Ohio. Test pilot James Taylor reported smooth handling and excellent visibility. The mid-engine configuration placed the pilot high, with no engine cowling blocking forward view. Initial trials recorded a top speed of 390 miles per hour and a climb to 20,000 feet in 5.8 minutes. The Army was impressed. Project officers wrote that the XP-39 represented a radical departure in pursuit design, justified by firepower concentration unprecedented in American practice. But the cannon itself remained untested in flight. Ground firings at Wright Field revealed the first problems. The weapon's recoil, 8,000 pounds of force, transmitted through the nose structure into the airframe. After 18 consecutive shots, the feed mechanism jammed. Springs in the ammunition chute deformed under vibration. Technicians cleared the stoppage, reloaded, and fired again. The gun jammed after 22 rounds. An engineering report dated July 1939 noted, "Weapon functions adequately in static mount. The vibration environment in aircraft installation exceeds design tolerance. Feed reliability requires improvement." The Air Corps accepted the limitation as temporary. Orders were placed for 13 YP-39 service test aircraft. Engineering teams at Bell and at Army Ordnance began redesigning the feed system. Meanwhile, other changes accumulated. An armor plate was added behind the pilot seat, 1/4-inch steel weighing 64 pounds. Self-sealing fuel tanks replaced the original rubber cells, adding another 40 pounds. A radio set, mandatory for combat operations, went into the fuselage aft of the cockpit, 32 pounds. Oxygen bottles, emergency equipment, and additional ammunition brought the gross weight from 5,300 pounds to 6,200. The added weight degraded performance. The service ceiling dropped from 38,000 feet to 32,000. The rate of climb fell by 12%. The turbocharger that enabled high-altitude performance became a maintenance problem. It required complex ducting, added weight, and failed repeatedly during trials. In September 1940, the Air Corps made a decision that would define the Airacobra's operational life. To simplify production and reduce cost, the turbocharger was deleted. The P-39 would rely on a single-stage, single-speed supercharger, adequate below 15,000 feet, marginal above. Production contracts were signed. Bell's factory in Buffalo began tooling for mass manufacture. By December 1941, the Army had ordered 863 P-39s. The press called it the most heavily armed fighter in the world. None of those aircraft had fired the 37mm cannon in combat. None had proven the feed system under sustained maneuvering loads. The weapon that justified the entire design remained, in the words of one test officer, a promise on paper. Acceptance testing began in the spring of 1941. Air Corps evaluators flew P-39B models through gunnery profiles, aerobatic sequences, and high-G turns. The cannon jammed in every test series. Official acceptance criteria required the weapon to fire 30 rounds, a full ammunition drum without stoppage. The P-39 failed that standard in 16 consecutive trials. Average rounds fired before jam, 13.4. Engineers traced the problem to multiple causes. The ammunition feed used a spiral track machined into an aluminum drum. Each 37mm shell weighed 1.6 pounds. Under acceleration, inertia caused the shells to bind against the track. Springs intended to keep tension on the belt weakened after repeated compressions. At load factors above 2.5 Gs, routine in combat maneuvering, the feed stopped advancing. Recoil compounded the issue. Each shot drove the cannon rearward against its mount with 8,000 pounds of force. The mount flexed. Vibration resonated through the nose structure. After 12 to 15 rounds, harmonic oscillation exceeded the feed mechanism's tolerance. The belt skipped a position. The next shell failed to align with the chamber. The gun was seized. Test pilots reported the problem in blunt terms. Captain Harold Harris wrote in March 1941, "Weapon unreliable. Pilots cannot depend on primary armament. Recommend restriction to short bursts pending feed redesign." The Air Corps issued Technical Order 0125 EJ1. Firing of 37mm cannon restricted to bursts not exceeding 3 rounds. Continuous fire prohibited. That limitation negated the weapon's intended role. A bomber interception required sustained fire to ensure hits at high closing speeds. 3-round bursts provided insufficient probability of striking a maneuvering target. Pilots would have to rely on the secondary armament, the .250 caliber Brownings in the nose. Yet production continued. The United States was not yet at war, but war was visible on every horizon. Britain was fighting alone. Germany occupied most of Europe. Japan was expanding through China and Southeast Asia. The Air Corps needed fighters immediately, even flawed ones. By the summer of 1941, Bell had delivered 230 P-39s. Another 693 were on order. The Airacobra was in full production. Armament specification for production models: 1 37mm M4 cannon, 30 rounds, feed rate 150 rounds per minute theoretical, 60 rounds per minute sustainable. 250 caliber M2 Brownings, 200 rounds each, feed rate 800 rounds per minute per gun. For 30 caliber M2 Brownings in wings, 1,000 rounds total, feed rate 1,200 rounds per minute combined. On paper, the battery was devastating. In practice, the 37mm remained the weak link. Army evaluators recommended modifications. Bell engineers proposed strengthened feed springs, revised track geometry, and improved shell retention. Each change required retooling. Each delay pushed costs higher and schedules later. The Air Corps faced a choice: halt production for redesign or accept the limitation and adapt tactics. The decision was made in Washington. Production would continue. Field units would learn to work around the cannon's flaws. Technical guidance emphasized short bursts, low G firing, and immediate transition to machine guns if the cannon jammed. Meanwhile, another customer was evaluating the Airacobra under harsher conditions. The Royal Air Force received 80 Airacobra Mark Is in the summer of 1941 under direct purchase contract. Serial numbers AH-570 through AH-649 arrived at maintenance units in July. No. 601 Squadron at Duxford was tasked with operational evaluation. British pilots had high expectations. The Airacobra's specifications promised performance competitive with the Spitfire Mark V below 15,000 feet, with heavier armament. The 37mm cannon, if reliable, would give the RAF a bomber-killing capability no British fighter possessed. Trials began on August 9, 1941. Squadron leader Sir Archibald Hope led the first combat readiness sortie. A high-altitude climb followed by gunnery runs against a towed drogue. The cannon jammed on the fourth shot. Hope landed, debriefed the armorer, and tried again the next day. The gun fired 11 rounds, then ceased. Over the following week, 601 Squadron flew 23 sorties. The 37mm functioned without stoppage in only 4. Engineering officers compiled detailed reports. Form 721, dated August 15, listed 14 separate gun stoppages across 9 aircraft. Causes included feed spring failure, belt skip, chamber obstruction, recoil lug fracture, and firing pin breakage. One incident was particularly revealing. On August 18, pilot officer Michael Robinson engaged in a mock dogfight with a Spitfire at 8,000 feet. He fired a 2-second burst, approximately 5 shells. The cannon jammed. Robinson attempted to clear the stoppage using the cockpit charging handle. The handle sheared off. He returned to base with a fully loaded, inoperable gun protruding from his aircraft's nose. The RAF's assessment was unambiguous. Report FT237/41, submitted to the Air Ministry on August 25, concluded, Airacobra primary armament unreliable for operational employment. Feed mechanism fails under recoil stress and maneuvering loads. High-altitude performance inadequate for interception duties. Aircraft unsuitable for fighter command use. Britain cancelled further orders. The 80 delivered aircraft were returned to the United States. Most were reassigned to training units. A few went to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. For the Airacobra, the British rejection was a reputational disaster. The RAF was the most experienced fighter force in the world in 1941. If British pilots judged the aircraft unsuitable, that verdict carried weight. But the rejection also contained a lesson that would become significant later. British pilots praised the Airacobra's handling below 10,000 feet. Visibility was excellent. Stability in gun platforms was outstanding. The two 50 caliber Brownings functioned flawlessly. If the cannon could be made reliable or simply removed, the airframe had potential. That potential would be realized far from Britain, under conditions its designers never anticipated. The 8th Fighter Group deployed to New Guinea in April 1942 with 39 P-39D models. Their mission: defend Port Moresby against Japanese bombing raids and intercept Zero fighters escorting them. On April 26, 12 Airacobras scrambled to intercept a formation of 18 Mitsubishi G4M bombers escorted by 9 Zeros. The engagement occurred at 12,000 feet, within the P-39's effective altitude band. Lieutenant Boyd Wagner led the first firing pass. He closed to 300 yards and pressed the trigger. The 37mm fired 4 rounds. The 5th jammed. Wagner switched to his 50 caliber guns, scored hits on a G4MS port engine, and broke away as a Zero dove on his tail. Of 12 Airacobras in that engagement, 9 reported cannon stoppages. Average rounds fired before jam, 11. The 8th Fighter Group lost 2 aircraft that day, both to Zero fighters. One pilot, Lieutenant John Lane, was shot down with a full load of 37mm ammunition still aboard. Post-recovery inspection showed his cannon had jammed after the 3rd shot. He never cleared the stoppage before a Zero's 20mm cannon tore through his wing root. Mission reports from April and May 1942 document the pattern. In 43 combat sorties, 8th Fighter Group pilots fired the 37mm cannon in 27 engagements. Stoppages occurred in 16. Stoppage rate, 59%. After-action summary dated May 5, compiled by Group Armament Officer Captain Robert de Haven. Cannon unreliable in combat conditions. Feed failures occur under high-G maneuvering. Pilots report loss of confidence in primary weapons. Majority of engagements resolved using 50 caliber armament only. Recommended tactical doctrine emphasizes Browning guns as primary batteries. Field mechanics attempted repairs. Feed springs were replaced. Ammunition was inspected round by round for dimensional irregularities. Some crews polished the feed track by hand, hoping to reduce friction. None of these measures significantly improved reliability. By June 8, fighter group doctrine had evolved. Pilots were instructed to fire 1 or 2 rounds from the cannon as an opening shot, then immediately transition to machine guns. The 37mm became a psychological weapon. Its presence might deter enemy pilots, but not a reliable combat tool. Production records show that of the 206 P-39s lost in the Pacific Theater through December 1942, 74 were shot down with cannon ammunition fully loaded. The weapon designed to kill bombers with a single shot had become deadweight. Across the ocean, another air force was receiving the same aircraft in far greater numbers. In September 1942, the first P-39 Airacobras arrived in Fairbanks, Alaska, bound for the Soviet Union. They came via the Alaska-Siberia ferrying route, ALSIB, a chain of airfields stretching from Great Falls, Montana, through Canada and Alaska, then across the Bering Strait into Siberia. Under the Lend-Lease Act, the United States supplied the Soviet Union with aircraft, tanks, trucks, and raw materials. The Airacobra became one of the most numerous aircraft types delivered. From 1942 through 1944, 4,719 P-39s crossed the ALSIB route. An additional 212 arrived via the Persian Corridor and Arctic convoys. Soviet pilots and technicians met the aircraft at Krasnoyarsk, the main reception point in Siberia. Ferry crews delivered the planes with American markings and English-language placards. Soviet ground teams repainted them in Red Air Force camouflage, stenciled Cyrillic instructions in cockpits, and prepared them for combat. The first question Soviet evaluators asked: why did the Americans send a fighter whose main gun didn't work? Soviet test pilots at the AnywayThe conducted trials identical to those performed at Wright Field and Duxford. Results matched. The 37mm M4 cannon jammed frequently under maneuvering loads. Average rounds before stoppage, 15. Stoppage rate, 61%. A technical bulletin issued in December 1942 advised Soviet pilots: fire cannon in bursts not exceeding 3 shots. Sustained fire causes feed failure. Rely on synchronized machine guns for continuous fire. The Red Air Force adapted. Soviet doctrine at that stage of the war emphasized low-altitude combat. German bombers, Junkers Ju-88s, Heinkel He-111s, operated below 8,000 meters. Luftwaffe fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s, Focke-Wulf FW-190s, engaged primarily between 3,000 and 6,000 meters. The Airacobra excelled in that altitude band. At 5,000 meters, the P-39N model achieved 480 kilometers per hour. Acceleration was excellent. Visibility from the raised cockpit was superior to German fighters. The nose-mounted 50 caliber Brownings produced tightly grouped fire, critical for deflection shooting. Soviet pilots learned to ignore the 37mm except as a weapon of last resort. They practiced gunnery using only the Brownings. Some units requested the cannon be removed entirely to save weight. That request was denied. Modification would require factory-level work, but the intent was clear. AnywayThe test data from March 1943 recorded the following for the P-39N. Maximum speed at 5,000 meters, 478 kilometers per hour. Climb to 5,000 meters, 6.1 minutes. Service ceiling, 9,700 meters. Armament, 1 37mm M4, 30 rounds. Unreliable. 2 50 caliber M2 Brownings, 200 rounds each. Reliable. For 30 caliber M2 Brownings, 1,000 rounds total reliable. Soviet evaluators noted, aircraft performs effectively below 6,000 meters when primary reliance is placed on machine gun armament. Cannons suitable for ground attack only. That assessment would guide Soviet tactical employment for the remainder of the war. Major Alexander Ivanovich Pokryshkin flew the P-39 Airacobra from April 1943 until the end of the war. He scored 59 confirmed victories, making him the second highest scoring Soviet ace. Most of those kills came in an Airacobra. Pokryshkin commanded the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, operating over the Kuban bridgehead in southern Russia. His aircraft, nicknamed White 100, carried personal markings and a battle log painted below the canopy. Pokryshkin's combat reports provide the clearest documentation of how Soviet pilots used the Airacobra effectively despite the cannon's flaws. On April 9, 1943, Pokryshkin intercepted a formation of Junkers Ju-87 dive bombers escorted by Bf-109G models. He dove from 7,000 meters, built speed to 550 kilometers per hour, and closed on a Ju-87 from the rear quarter. At 400 meters, he fired the 37mm. 3 shells left the gun. The 4th jammed. Pokryshkin's combat log entry, preserved in the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense in Moscow. Engaged enemy bomber. Cannon jammed after the 3rd shell. Switched to Brownings. Observed strikes on fuselage and port wing. The target caught fire and descended. That pattern repeated throughout Pokryshkin's combat career. He used the cannon only for brief opening shots. The moment it jammed, or after 3 rounds, whichever came first, he switched to machine guns. The Brownings completed the kill. Pokryshkin developed a tactical system optimized for the Airacobra's strengths and limitations. He called it altitude, speed, maneuver, fire. The method emphasized energy tactics. Gain altitude before engagement, dive to build speed, use superior acceleration to control the fight, and concentrate fire from stable gun platforms. The 37mm played almost no role in that system. Pokryshkin wrote in a post-war interview, "The cannon was impressive on the ground. In combat, I trusted the Brownings. They never failed." Other Soviet aces echoed that judgment. Grigory Rechkalov, Pokryshkin's wingman, scored 56 victories in the P-39. His armorer recorded that Rechkalov fired the 37mm in fewer than 20% of his engagements. Nikolai Gyulov scored 57 victories flying P-39s in the 19th Guards Fighter Regiment. His memoir, published in 1985, includes this passage. "We were told the American cannon would destroy any German aircraft with one hit. Perhaps it would have if it worked. In practice, we killed Germans with 50 caliber bullets, the same as the Americans did in their other fighters. Soviet field workshops improvised modifications. Armorers polished feed tracks, adjusted spring tensions, and reinforced mount points. Some crews welded stops into the feed mechanism, limiting it to 10 rounds to reduce cumulative vibration. Others disconnected the trigger circuit entirely, leaving the cannon installed but inert. None of these modifications were officially authorized. They emerged from field necessity, pilots and mechanics solving problems that engineers in Buffalo and Dayton had failed to fix. By mid-1943, Soviet doctrine reflected operational reality. A training directive issued by the 5th Air Army in July stated, Airacobra cannon to be used primarily against ground targets. Air-to-air engagements to be conducted using synchronized machine guns. The fighter built around a single powerful weapon had become effective by minimizing that weapon's use. While Soviet pilots adapted tactics in combat, American engineers attempted to fix the cannon itself. The Engineering Division at Wright Field and the Proving Ground Command at Eglin Field, Florida, conducted systematic tests to identify failure modes and evaluate improved designs. In June 1943, a P-39Q model, serial number 4220750, arrived at Eglin for armament trials. The aircraft carried an upgraded M10 cannon, a redesigned version of the M4 with strengthened feed components and revised belt geometry. Test objectives: measure jam rate, firing duration, and accuracy under simulated combat conditions. Engineers mounted accelerometers on the cannon, the nose structure, and the cockpit floor. High-speed cameras recorded feed motion during firing. Strain gauges measured recoil forces and structural flex. The first test series involved static firing on a ground mount, no aircraft vibration, no G-loads. The M10 fired 120 consecutive rounds without stopping. Feed rate averaged 146 rounds per minute. Accuracy was excellent, 92% of shots within a 2-foot circle at 400 yards. The second series involved flight testing. Pilots flew firing passes against towed targets at speeds between 250 and 400 miles per hour. They executed rolls, tight turns, and pull-ups during firing to simulate combat maneuvering. The M10 jammed in 22 of 100 bursts. Stoppage rate, 22%, significantly better than the M4's 60%, but still unacceptable for combat. Average firing duration before jam, 1.9 seconds. At a feed rate of 146 rounds per minute, that equated to fewer than 5 rounds per burst. Engineers analyzed high-speed film and accelerometer data. The failure mechanism remained consistent. Structural flex under recoil transmitted harmonic vibration to the feed track. After 12 to 15 shots, resonance reached a threshold where the belt skipped a tooth. The next shell failed to align. The gun stopped. A detailed engineering report, designated ENG 43272, concluded, M10 cannon represents improvement over M4, but does not meet reliability standards for continuous combat employment. Fundamental issue is structural isolation of feed mechanism from recoil forces. Redesign would require strengthened nose structure, adding approximately 120 pounds. Recommendation: restrict use to short bursts. Emphasize secondary armament. That recommendation was never implemented as formal doctrine. By mid-1943, the United States had better options. The P-38 Lightning carried one 20mm cannon and 4 50 caliber Brownings, all reliable. The P-47 Thunderbolt mounted 8 50 caliber Brownings with combined fire rates exceeding 5,000 rounds per minute. The P-51 Mustang, entering service that summer, carried 6 50 calibers with superior accuracy and reliability. Production of the P-39 continued because Soviet demand remained high and existing tooling was paid for. The United States Army Air Forces, however, quietly shifted the type to secondary roles. Training, coastal patrol, and ground attack in theaters where air opposition was minimal. The Airacobra's identity was changing. It was no longer marketed as a frontline interceptor with a bomber-killing gun. It became a low-altitude fighter-attack aircraft whose armament happened to include a large-caliber cannon, mostly unused. By the end of 1943, production and combat data allowed comprehensive analysis of the Airacobra's performance. The numbers revealed patterns that neither propaganda nor optimism could obscure. Total P-39 production through December 1943, 7,821 aircraft. Final production run would reach 9,558 by August 1944. Of those, 4,719 went to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. Another 212 reached Britain, Canada, Australia, and Free French units. The remaining 4,627 served with United States forces. Combat loss rates told a stark story. In the Pacific Theater, the United States Army Air Forces lost 706 P-39s to enemy action between April 1942 and December 1943. Confirmed air-to-air victories, 384. Loss-to-kill ratio, 1.84 to 1. That ratio compared unfavorably to other American fighters. The P-38 Lightning achieved 2.6 to 1. The P-47 Thunderbolt reached 3.1 to 1 in Europe. The P-51 Mustang, in limited service by late 1943, already showed 4.0 to 1. The Airacobra's poor showing reflected its limitations: inadequate high-altitude performance, unreliable primary armament, and restricted operational envelope. The Soviet experience was different. Red Air Force units claimed more than 5,000 air-to-air victories flying P-39s between 1942 and 1945. Soviet loss records are incomplete, but available data suggest exchange ratios above 2 to 1. better than the United States achieved with the same aircraft. That difference reflected Soviet tactical adaptation. Red Air Force pilots fought at altitudes where the Airacobra performed well. They used the aircraft's strengths, visibility, stability, low-altitude speed, while avoiding its weaknesses. Most importantly, they didn't rely on the 37mm cannon. Analysis of ammunition expenditure provides the clearest evidence. A study conducted by the Air Technical Service Command in Dayton, Ohio, examined ammunition reports from both United States and Soviet units. The findings, published in March 1944, United States units in the Pacific, 37mm rounds expended per confirmed kill averaged 4.2. 50 caliber rounds per kill averaged 163. Soviet units on the Eastern Front, 37mm rounds per kill averaged 2.1. 12.7mm and 7.62mm rounds per kill averaged 274. Both air forces achieved kills primarily with machine guns, not the cannon. The difference: Soviet pilots fired fewer cannon rounds because they relied on it less. Further evidence came from maintenance records. United States units reported cannon stoppages in 58% of engagements where the weapon was fired. Soviet units reported 61%. The gun failed at the same rate in both air forces. Some United States units in the Pacific adopted an extreme solution. They removed the 37mm cannon entirely, replaced it with ballast to maintain center of gravity, and flew combat missions with machine guns only. 8th Fighter Group records show at least 12 P-39s modified this way between August and November 1943. The modification was unofficial and unauthorized. When word reached Wright Field, engineering officers prohibited further removals. But the fact that field units attempted it, and that pilots preferred flying without the aircraft's signature weapon, illustrated the depth of the reliability problem. By late 1943, the Airacobra's operational reality was clear to everyone involved. Effective as a low-altitude fighter, when its primary armament was ignored or removed, the aircraft conceived around a single devastating shot succeeded only when that shot was never taken. On October 14, 1943, the United States Army Air Forces issued Memorandum AF 1638-43. The subject line, P-39 Operational Employment, Revised Doctrine. The memo removed the P-39 from primary interceptor roles. It reassigned the type to ground attack, coastal patrol, and training. The decision was classified restricted, meaning it was not released to the press or to foreign governments. The justification, summarized in 2 paragraphs, cited performance limitations above 15,000 feet, unreliable primary armament, and availability of superior types for air superiority missions. The memo represented official acknowledgement of what pilots had known since 1942. The Airacobra was not competitive as a frontline fighter. Several factors drove the decision. The P-38, P-47, and P-51 were entering service in large numbers. All 3 offered better altitude performance, equal or superior armament with reliable weapons and longer range. The Air Forces no longer needed a compromised design. Production continued because canceling contracts would disrupt industrial schedules and waste tooling investment. Bell Aircraft was already transitioning to the P-63 King Cobra, an enlarged, more powerful derivative of the P-39. That aircraft promised better performance and, theoretically, a more reliable cannon installation. But the P-63 would not reach operational units until 1944, and even then in limited numbers. Most would go to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. The United States Army Air Forces had moved on. Engineering division documents from late 1943 reveal internal debate over whether to fix the cannon or abandon it. One faction argued that with sufficient development, the M10 could meet reliability standards. Another faction pointed out that 650 caliber Brownings delivered more effective firepower than any single cannon, regardless of caliber. The debate ended when gunnery statistics were compiled. A comparison of armament effectiveness across fighter types showed the following. P-39 with 1 37mm M4 and 2 50 caliber Brownings. Combined fire rate approximately 1,000 rounds per minute, reliability 61%. P-38 with one 20mm M2 and four 50 caliber Brownings. Combined fire rate approximately 3,200 rounds per minute. Reliability 96%. P-47 with eight 50 caliber Brownings. Combined fire rate approximately 6,400 rounds per minute. Reliability 98%. P-51 with six 50 caliber Brownings. Combined fire rate approximately 4,800 rounds per minute. Reliability 97%. The conclusion was inescapable. Reliable volume of fire defeated unreliable single-shot lethality. Armament philosophy shifted accordingly. Future fighter designs would prioritize reliability and sustained fire rate. The United States Navy had already adopted that approach with the F-6F Hellcat, 650 caliber Brownings, no cannon. The Army Air Forces followed. The P-39 remained in production through mid-1944, but its role diminished. In the Pacific, P-38s and P-47s took over air superiority missions. In Europe, P-47s and P-51s dominated. The Airacobra was relegated to secondary theaters. Alaska, the Caribbean, training bases in the continental United States. The Soviet Union continued operating P-39s until 1945. Soviet doctrine had never relied on the cannon, so the United States policy shift made no difference to Red Air Force employment. For Bell Aircraft, the downgrade was a reputational blow. The company had staked its future on radical design concepts. The P-39 represented that philosophy, and its failure suggested that radicalism without reliability was worthless. Bell's next project, the P-59 Airacobra, would be America's first jet fighter. But it too would be deemed inadequate for combat and relegated to training. Bell would not produce a successful frontline fighter during World War II. The lesson was clear. Innovation that couldn't be made to work was not innovation at all. Soviet regimental workshops became laboratories of necessity. Armorers and mechanics, working in unheated sheds with hand tools, modified Airacobras to overcome the flaws that American factories had failed to fix. The modifications were not authorized by higher command. They emerged from the tactical reality that pilots faced daily. A gun that jammed at the moment of greatest need was worse than no gun at all. At the 20th Fighter Aviation Regiment, stationed near Kharkov in January 1944, the regimental armorer Senior Sergeant Ivan Konstantinovich Volkov kept a modification log. The log survived the war and is now held in the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense. Entry dated January 12, 1944. Aircraft number 14. Pilot request. Remove 37mm cannon. Weight saving 105 kilograms. Nose ballast added 42 kilograms. Center of gravity adjusted. Test flight confirms improved roll rate and reduced vibration. Pilot reports aircraft feels lighter, responds faster. By March 1944, 6 of the regiment's 23 Airacobras had been modified the same way. Pilots flying modified aircraft reported higher mission completion rates and better maneuverability in combat. Other regiments adopted different solutions. At the 4th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, armorers welded mechanical stops into the feed mechanism, limiting the cannon to exactly 10 rounds. The logic: 10 rounds would fire before vibration reached critical levels. If the gun jammed after 10, at least the pilot got some use from it. A third approach involved feed track polishing. Using emery cloth and oil, armorers hand-polished the spiral feed track inside each ammunition drum. The process took 4 hours per drum. Results were inconsistent. Some drums showed improved reliability, others did not, but pilots believed it helped. That belief alone may have been tactically valuable. The most revealing modification involved trigger circuits. Some regiments rewired the gun selector switch to disconnect the cannon entirely while leaving it physically installed. Pilots could toggle the switch on for ground attack missions, where a jammed gun was inconvenient but not fatal, and toggle it off for air combat, where reliability mattered more than firepower. Soviet pilots discussed these modifications openly in post-war memoirs. Nikolai Golodnikov, who flew with the 115th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, wrote in 1978, "We joked that the American cannon was a secret weapon, Secret because it never worked when you needed it. Our mechanics were cleverer than the Americans who designed it. They made the Airacobra into a real fighter by taking away the thing it was supposed to be built around. Field modifications had tactical consequences. Aircraft with cannons removed showed improved roll rates due to reduced nose weight and eliminated vibration. Pilots reported better control harmony and crisper response. Some Soviet aces, men who had flown multiple fighter types, claimed the cannonless Airacobra handled better than the Yakovlev Yak-9 or the Lavochkin La-5. That claim was never tested systematically. But the fact that experienced combat pilots preferred an unauthorized field modification over the factory configuration speaks to the severity of the original design flaw. By mid-1944, Soviet operational orders reflected field practice. A directive from the Second Air Army, dated June 1944, stated, Airacobra cannon armament to be employed against ground targets only. Air-to-air combat to be conducted using synchronized machine gun armament. Regimental commanders authorized to approve field modifications improving reliability and handling. That order represented formal acknowledgement that the weapon defining the aircraft's design was operationally irrelevant. Maintenance records from Soviet units show that cannon-related stoppages declined through 1944. Not because the gun improved, but because pilots stopped using it. By the final year of the war, some Airacobra units reported 37mm ammunition expended in air combat over periods of 3 to 4 months. The fighter built around a gun had become a fighter defined by the absence of that gun's use. By 1944, armament doctrine in both the United States and Soviet air forces had shifted decisively away from large-caliber single-shot weapons toward high-volume, reliable machine gun batteries. The shift was driven by data. Gunnery analysis sections in both countries compiled statistics on ammunition expenditure, kill probabilities, and weapon reliability. The numbers told the same story. A United States Army Air Forces Armament Laboratory study, published in April 1944, compared theoretical versus actual lethality of fighter armament. Theoretical lethality, calculated from muzzle energy and projectile mass. 1 37mm high-explosive shell. 7,800 foot-pounds energy. Lethal radius against aircraft structure 3.2 feet. 150 caliber armor-piercing incendiary round. 2,900 foot-pounds energy. Lethal radius 1.1 feet. Actual combat lethality, kills per 1,000 rounds expended. 37mm M4 cannon. 12.3 kills per 1,000 rounds. Based on Pacific Theater data. 1942 through 1943. 50 caliber M2 Browning. 8.7 kills per 1,000 rounds. Same data set. On the surface, the cannon appeared superior. But the study included a critical additional metric, reliability-adjusted lethality. When stoppage rates were factored in, the comparison reversed. 37mm M4, 12.3 kills per 1,000 rounds times 39% reliability equals 4.8 effective kills per 1,000 rounds. 50 caliber M2, 8.7 kills per 1,000 rounds times 98% reliability equals 8.5 effective kills per 1,000 rounds. The 50 caliber Browning delivered 77% more effective lethality than the 37mm cannon. The study concluded, reliability and volume of fire are the decisive factors in fighter armament effectiveness. Single-shot lethality is irrelevant if the weapon fails before the shot is taken. Multi-gun installations provide redundancy, sustained fire capability, and higher probability of target damage. That conclusion shaped every subsequent United States fighter design. The P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, mounted 6 50 caliber Brownings. The F-82 Twin Mustang carried the same. When the Air Force finally adopted cannon armament in the late 1940s, it chose revolver-type guns with demonstrated reliability under high G-loads. The Soviet Union reached identical conclusions through parallel analysis. Red Air Force Armament Doctrine, revised in 1944, stated, fighter primary armament shall consist of multiple automatic weapons with proven feed reliability. Single large-caliber cannon acceptable only if reliability exceeds 90% under combat maneuvering loads. No existing cannon met that standard. Soviet post-war fighters, the MiG-15, the MiG-17, would eventually carry 37mm and 23mm cannon, but only after years of feed system development and testing. The P-39's troubled history became a case study in military engineering courses. The aircraft appeared in a 1948 United States Army Ordnance School textbook under the heading Design Driven by Improving Technology. The textbook passage read, "The Bell P-39 Airacobra was designed around a 37mm cannon whose reliability had not been validated under operational conditions. The resulting aircraft achieved modest success only when employed in ways that minimized reliance on the weapon that defined its configuration. The lesson: armament must be proven before the aircraft is designed around it. That lesson influenced Cold War procurement policy. When the Air Force issued specifications for new fighters in the 1950s and 60s, armament reliability became a mandatory qualification criterion. No weapon system could be approved for production until it demonstrated 95% reliability under full combat acceleration profiles. The Airacobra's failure created the standard that prevented future failures. By 1945, both the United States and the Soviet Union had moved beyond the P-39. American production lines built P-51s, P-47s, and P-38s. Soviet factories produced Yak-3s, Yak-9s, and La-7s. The Airacobra remained in service only where nothing better was available. The war that the P-39 was designed to fight had passed it by. The doctrine that justified its design had been discarded. The weapon that defined its existence had been abandoned by the pilots who flew it. When the war ended in August 1945, statistical compilation teams in both the United States and the Soviet Union began assembling comprehensive combat records. The Airacobra's data filled thick binders in archives in Moscow and Dayton, Ohio. The Air Technical Service Command at Wright Field published a summary analysis in March 1946. The document, classified confidential and not declassified until 1973, provided the most complete assessment of the P-39's combat performance. Production and delivery. Total P-39 production: 9,558 aircraft. Delivered to United States Army Air Forces: 4,627. Delivered to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease: 4,719. Delivered to other allies: Britain, Free France, Portugal: 212.
Combat emploiement.
United States units flew approximately 115,000 combat sorties in P-39s between April 1942 and August 1945. Soviet units flew an estimated 320,000 combat sorties in the same period. Soviet records incomplete. Figure extrapolated from available data. Loss rates. United States: 706 P-39s lost to enemy action. 384 enemy aircraft destroyed. Exchange ratio: 0.54 to 1. Soviet Union: approximately 2,100 P-39s lost to enemy action. Estimated 5,000 plus enemy aircraft destroyed. Exchange ratio: approximately 2.4 to 1. Soviet victory claim subject to significant uncertainty due to overclaiming common in Red Air Force records. Armament effectiveness. The most revealing statistics concerned weapon usage. The Air Technical Service Command analyzed ammunition expenditure reports from 1943 and 1944, the peak years of P-39 operations. United States units in the Pacific: 37mm rounds expended, approximately 68,000. 50 caliber rounds expended, approximately 12,400,000. 30 caliber rounds expended, approximately 18,700,000. Proportion of 37mm to total ammunition: 0.22% by round count, 4.1% by weight. Soviet units on the Eastern Front: 37mm rounds expended, approximately 112,000. 12.7mm rounds expended, approximately 19 million. 7.62mm rounds expended, approximately 43 million. Proportion of 37mm to total ammunition, 0.18% by round count, 3.7% by weight. In both air forces, the cannon that defined the aircraft accounted for less than 5% of ammunition expended. Further analysis broke down ammunition use by mission type. In air-to-air combat, the proportion of 37mm ammunition dropped to less than 2%. Most cannon rounds were expended against ground targets, trucks, trains, bunkers, where a jammed gun was inconvenient but not fatal. The Air Technical Service Command report concluded, P-39 Airacobra achieved operational success in Soviet service despite, not because of primary armament design. Aircraft strengths, visibility, low-altitude performance, handling qualities were exploited effectively when tactical employment minimized reliance on unreliable 37mm cannon. United States employment suffered due to high-altitude fighter requirements inconsistent with aircraft performance envelope. Lesson: aircraft design must align with intended operational role and armament must be proven reliable before production commitment. Soviet post-war assessments echoed those conclusions. A 1946 report from the Red Air Force Scientific Research Institute stated, Airacobra proved effective in the Great Patriotic War due to suitability for low-altitude combat and adaptation of tactics to aircraft limitations. Primary armament was unreliable and contributed minimally to combat effectiveness. Success achieved through pilot skill and machine gun armament. The Airacobra remained in Soviet service until 1949, used primarily for training. The last operational unit retired its P-39s in May 1949, replacing them with Yakovlev Yak-15 jets. In the United States, the last P-39s were withdrawn from active service in 1946. A few survived as test aircraft and ground instructional airframes. Most were scrapped. By 1950, fewer than 200 Airacobras remained in existence worldwide. Of those, none retained a functional 37mm cannon. The weapons had been removed, disabled, or simply allowed to corrode into uselessness. The fighter built around a gun ended its service life as a fighter without one. The Airacobra's legacy was not its combat record. Thousands of aircraft types served in World War II. Most are forgotten. The P-39 is remembered because its failure taught lessons that shaped the next generation of military aviation. The most immediate lesson concerned armament qualification standards. Before the war, aircraft cannons were tested primarily in static mounts. Feed reliability under maneuvering loads, the condition that mattered most in combat, was rarely evaluated. The P-39's experience changed that. In 1946, the United States Army Air Forces issued new armament qualification standards. Technical Order 114A specified, all aircraft cannon installations shall be tested through a minimum of 5,000 rounds fired under simulated combat conditions, including maneuvers at load factors up to 6 Gs, sustained firing at maximum rate, and environmental conditions spanning operational temperature range. Minimum acceptable reliability. 95% mean rounds between failures. Those standards were stringent. Existing cannon designs, including the 37mm M4 and M10, could not meet them. New designs were required. The United States Ordnance Department initiated development of revolver-type cannon in 1947. Revolver guns used a rotating cylinder to chamber rounds, eliminating the belt feed mechanism that plagued the M4. The first successful design, the T-160 cannon, later standardized as the M39, entered service in 1953. It fired 20mm rounds at 1,500 rounds per minute with reliability exceeding 98%. The M39 became standard armament on the F-86 Sabre, the first United States jet fighter to carry cannons successfully. Over Korea, the M39 proved reliable under sustained combat use. The Airacobra's failure had eventually produced a weapon that worked. Other nations learned similar lessons. Britain, France, and the Soviet Union all developed improved cannon in the late 1940s, driven by wartime experience showing that existing designs were inadequate. The British Aden, the French DEFA, and the Soviet NR-30 all used revolver mechanisms and all met strict reliability standards before entering production. The second lesson concerned design philosophy. The P-39 represented an approach common in the 1930s. Design the aircraft around a specific weapon or technology, assuming that weapon will work as intended. Post-war design philosophy reversed that approach. Aircraft were designed around operational requirements. Weapons were selected based on proven performance. If no suitable weapon existed, it was developed and tested before the aircraft design was finalized. The F-86 Sabre, for example, was designed as a high-altitude day fighter. Armament was 650 caliber Brownings, proven reliable. Only after the aircraft was in service was it rearmed with cannon, and only after those cannon passed rigorous qualification testing. That conservative approach defined American fighter design through the 1950s and 60s. The F-100, the F-104, the F-4 Phantom, all carried weapons with demonstrated reliability before entering combat. The third lesson was cultural. The Airacobra's failure demonstrated that technological optimism without rigorous testing led to operational disappointment. That lesson influenced procurement policy across the Department of Defense. A 1952 study by the Rand Corporation, titled Weapon System Reliability and Operational Effectiveness, used the P-39 as a case study. The conclusion: theoretical performance is irrelevant if reliability is inadequate. Combat effectiveness depends on the probability that a weapon will function when needed, multiplied by its lethality if it functions. High lethality with low reliability produces lower effectiveness than moderate lethality with high reliability. That principle, reliability as the foundation of effectiveness, became central to Cold War military procurement. By 1950, the P-39 Airacobra had passed from active service into history. But its influence persisted in the standards, doctrines, and design philosophies that emerged from its failure. Final production numbers: 9,558 P-39s built between 1941 and 1944, 3,303 P-63 King Cobras, the improved derivative, built between 1943 and 1945. Combined total: 12,861 aircraft built around the concept of a heavy-nose cannon. Of those 12,861 aircraft, combat records suggest fewer than 15% ever achieved kills using the cannon. The vast majority succeeded when they succeeded through machine gun armament that was never supposed to be primary. The fighter conceived around a single powerful shot ultimately proved that in aerial combat reliability, not caliber, determines survival. That lesson, written in the combat reports of 2 air forces and the maintenance logs of 1,000 squadrons, remains valid today. Modern fighters carry complex weapon systems, missiles, radar-guided guns, electronic warfare suites. All are tested to standards that trace their lineage to the failures documented in Wright Field reports from 1943. The Airacobra's cannon misfired, but the lesson hit the target. The Bell P-39 Airacobra served in combat from 1942 to 1945. It flew over New Guinea and the Aleutians, over the Kuban and Ukraine, over North Africa and the Mediterranean. Thousands of pilots flew it. Hundreds died in it. Thousands more survived because of it. The aircraft's combat record was mixed. In American service, it was marginal, adequate for secondary theaters, inadequate for primary air superiority missions. In Soviet service, it was successful, one of the Red Air Force's preferred fighters, flown by top aces, credited with thousands of kills. But that success came with an asterisk. Soviet pilots succeeded by ignoring the weapon the aircraft was built to carry. They adapted tactics, modified equipment, and developed doctrine that worked around the cannon's flaws rather than depending on its strengths. That adaptation was a tribute to Soviet pilot skill and tactical flexibility. It was also an indictment of American engineering. An aircraft that succeeded only when its defining feature was disregarded represented a fundamental design failure. The numbers confirm it. 9,558 P-39s were built. Fewer than 25% of combat victories involved the 37mm cannon. More than 70% of pilots who flew the aircraft reported that they relied primarily on machine guns. The weapon that justified the design, that drove every configuration choice, that added weight and complexity and cost, that weapon contributed to fewer than 1 kill in 4. Post-war analysis asked the obvious question: Would a conventional fighter, with the engine in the nose and 650 caliber Brownings, have been more effective? The answer, based on data from P-47s and P-51s, was yes. A 6-gun P-39, if such a thing had existed, would likely have achieved better kill ratios with higher reliability and lower maintenance burden. But that aircraft was never built. Bell Aircraft committed to the mid-engine, cannon-armed configuration in 1938. By the time combat experience revealed the flaws, production was underway and contracts were signed. Changing the design would have meant canceling the program. So the Airacobra went to war as designed, and pilots made it work despite its flaws, not because of its strengths. Today, fewer than 30 P-39s survive. Most are in museums. A handful are maintained in flying condition by collectors and historical foundations. None retain operational 37mm cannon. The weapons are either disabled or replaced with ballast. Visitors to aviation museums walk past Airacobras and red placards describing them as heavily armed fighters with powerful nose cannons. The placards rarely mention that the cannon jammed in more than 60% of firing sequences, or that pilots learned to avoid using it, or that the aircraft's modest success came from ignoring its primary armament. That omission is understandable. Museum exhibits celebrate achievement, not failure. But understanding the Airacobra's real story, the gap between design intent and combat reality, teaches more than celebrating a weapon that never worked. The P-39 Airacobra was a fighter built around a gun that wouldn't fire. Its pilots made it succeed anyway. That success was a testament to human adaptability, tactical creativity, and the refusal to accept defeat even when equipment failed. But it was also a lesson. Technological ambition without rigorous validation leads to operational compromise. That lesson, learned painfully over 3 years of combat, shaped military procurement for the next generation. The fighter conceived around a single powerful shot proved that in aerial combat reliability, not caliber, determines survival. That truth, written in the combat reports of 2 air forces and the engineering studies of 2 nations, remains the foundation of fighter armament doctrine today. The Airacobra's cannon misfired, but its legacy hit the mark. If you value fact-based military history grounded in official reports and archival data, share your thoughts in the comments. Every reflection helps keep this history alive and honors the memory of those who served.